But I'm going to keep the introduction short because I know that you're more interested in what they have to say than where they come from. And Matthew, you will know, of course, Matthew is the director of the Art Gallery of Ontario. Before that, he was the chief curator at the AGO. And Matthew comes from a family that has been a vital part of the cultural life of this city for a long, long time. His father was Teitelbaum, well-known Canadian painter, personal hero of mine. And Janet Carding, new to our city, is the director of the Royal Ontario Museum. Lucky Janet. She comes from England, and she's worked in London, and she's worked in Sydney, Australia, and she's been here since September. So we're going to be nice, and we're going to be polite.
Please.
And we're going to be very interested in everything she has to say. So I have to sit down, so I should sit down now, but obviously the topic for tonight is museums. And obviously, as you all know, and maybe Janet, you maybe don't know quite what we've been through here in the city over the last, 10 years or so. We've gone through what we like to call a cultural renaissance. And basically, it's the most amazing irony that the money that made the Cultural Renaissance happen was money that came from the Super Bill program originally, which was a program, a shared cost program between the federal and the provincial governments. And in those days, it was Jean Chrétien and Mike Harris who, by the standards of 2011, seemed positively enlightened. It didn't seem that way at the time. But this is their legacy, to be fair to Mike Harris and Jean Chrétien, although one hates to have to be fair to either one of them. But the money that they made available was used by our cultural institutions, who are run, generally speaking, by very smart people who recognize an opportunity when they see it. They all glommed onto this program, and the result is that we have a whole new cultural landscape in the city of Toronto. So I guess it's a good point to begin our discussion. And what I'll do is I'll throw it open to maybe Matthew should go first since he's been here the longest. And I guess, Matthew, back in the old days, the gallery, the museum was a place where you went to see things. Now, the gallery, the museum is a place where you go to experience things. There's a difference. Go ahead.
I do think, is this on? It's okay? I do think that one of the achievements of Frank Gehry at the Art Gallery of Ontario is that he did create with us a building that is about looking, that is about seeing, that is about confronting and experiencing the object, seeing it, thinking about it. But I also think that there is in contemporary museum architecture a little bit of the spectacle, a little bit of the element of spectacle. I don't actually think the AGO is about spectacle, but I do think that Frank was interested in creating spaces with us of gathering and of sharing with purpose a certain kind of experience. So it was a bit more than looking, and it moved towards experience, but I think in the end, to the degree that the Art Gallery of Ontario is a successful building, it is because it delivers on the promise of extraordinary experiences with art.
But the AGO had been around for, 100-odd years, has gone through the Parkin edition, and then the Barton Myers edition, and then most recently the Frank Gehry edition. Clearly there was, the AGO felt there was a need to change the place. Why? It wasn't friendly before?
The Frank Gehry project was the 7th in our history, so it was actually an opportunity to make sense out of a series of buildings that actually, you could say, didn't connect particularly well. But at the core of our project was the most extraordinary gift of 2,000 works of art from Ken Thompson. Our project began with an argument about content. Our project began with the possibility of imagining a different experience of art through objects. And I don't believe that we had a strong argument for going back into our building less than 15 years after the Barton Myers.
It was less than 10, wasn't it?
It was about 12 or so.
I thought it was 8. It was 8. Anyway.
It was probably the shortest period between a major expansion and a subsequent one in the history of major institutions in North America. But again, we were given the opportunity to think anew about what it meant to experience Canadian art and European art, particularly at the Art Gallery through the extraordinary generosity of Ken Thompson. That started the conversation. And Ken had no interest in displacing what we already had. He was interested in adding to it. And hence, we began thinking about what a new building might look like.
And Janet, you come to Toronto from Australia and from London. So you've seen what's happening out there. Do we fit into a larger pattern?
Yes. A lot of museums and galleries over probably the last 15 years have been through a transformation. Not necessarily exactly the same as the one here in Toronto, but certainly a transformation. And some of it, exactly as you said, is about thinking of museums as places where you go to experience. So they've always been places for looking at the real thing, but I think increasingly they're seen as places where you go for inspiration, where you go to reflect, where you go to think and learn, and where you go with other people so that you can discuss things with them. And what a lot of museums, and my first experience of this was working in the UK in the 1990s, there was something called the Lottery Fund was created in the UK, and a lot of museums and galleries took the opportunity to put together capital projects that were transforming their buildings. And they were really transforming them in terms of becoming meeting places, in terms of becoming places where they're just good to go to. I mean, yes, there were government imperatives about doing more in terms of visitor services and having spaces that we could hire out. But I remember when I first worked at the Science Museum in the 1980s, you wouldn't have wanted to go to the cafe. I mean, it was just deeply unpleasant. You could get a nasty custard cream biscuit and an unpleasant cup of tea, but there was absolutely no reason to see the museum as a special place in that respect. It was not about encouraging you to linger in the space, and it wasn't really about encouraging you to think differently.
So in other words, the role that architecture plays is enormous.
I would think so.
Do you think that people are coming to museums, and Matthew, I want to ask you too, do they come to the AGO and do they come to the ROM to see Daniel Libeskind and Frank Gehry, or do they come to see the Minerals or the Maharaja show? I mean, why do they come?
I think they partly come to see the architecture, but I think they leave having really experienced the contents of the building. And I think what I hear is that people's critique of the architecture is built around whether it made for a good experience of the museum. And I've heard that for the ROM, and I've heard it for lots of other museums that I've been to as well. I mean, so certainly the architecture is a draw. People want to experience the building, but then they actually judge it. They judge it as to how successful it is as an experience, how successful it is as a container for the collections and for the interpretation.
And what about you, Matthew?
Yeah, I think that the notion that the building is an attraction is a very short-lived reality. And if you look at attendance patterns in museums, it's true that there's a blip at the beginning and then hold on to your seatbelt because the roller coaster starts. Because I think actually the building, the buzz of the building lasts for a relatively short period of time, in the sense of the buzz, the spectacle. It lasts for 6 to 8 months, I think.
Is that all?
Yeah, and I think if you look at museum attendance, you would see that. But all I'm saying is that people aren't coming for that as the main event. They are coming for the experience of the content, the central purpose of the institution. We said 2 years into our project that we were not building a building. We were building an experience. Because we felt if we fell in love with the idea of the building, we'd be improperly focused on what in the end was going to mean something to our city. And what was going to mean something to our city was people's relationship with works of art. I believe that in the end, Frank Gehry delivered something extraordinary in the way that he encourages people to look at works of art. But in the end, that's the main event. It's about the content. You know, we were very much helped, I think, in Toronto by the first of the Superbuild projects being the Canadian Opera. You know, because the sound in the hall is so incredible. And I remember saying to Richard Bradshaw, you know, you helped us all because you delivered on the promise of the building.
Well, I'm not so sure about that.
Pardon?
I said, I'm not so sure about that. What is the promise of the building? I mean, surely the promise of an opera house is about more than acoustics.
But the main promise is the main event, and the main event is the sound.
Well, you know, I understand what you're saying, but I've always thought that the opera house is in use, 3 or 4 times a week? Maybe it's used every night, but it sits empty most of the time as an object in the city. And I think that one of the things that failed in that project was the understanding that it's a part of the larger context of the city. And I think that's the interesting thing about the AGO ultimately, and about the ROM too, is that they make those institutions more, they connect those institutions to the city. I think that's an important thing. I think that, you know, from where I sit at the Star, I realize how intimidated people are by art galleries and museums and opera houses. A lot of people feel uncomfortable about that. And I think that they feel less so now, and I think that's a good thing.
I'd agree with that, and I think it's something that I've thought a lot about in terms of how you create spaces and experiences that are welcoming, that people feel as though they can drop into them, that people feel as though they're their space rather than that they've ventured onto foreign territory. And it's a hard thing, and it's something that you have to keep working at. And for me, I think the more that we can do in terms of creating a space that feels like that feels like it's their space. I haven't been to a museum where people tell me at the ROM they have this incredible affection for the place, and I haven't worked in a museum like that before. I mean, every museum I've worked in has its fans and its volunteers and its supporters, but people can stop me and they can tell me to the day when they first came to the ROM, and they can tell me what they did when they came there and how it has had such an impact on their lives. And ultimately, that's what we want to do. We'd like people to be able to see the world differently after they've been to the museum. And the ROM does that.
But at a certain point, that can work against the institution because people resent the changes that the administration wants to make.
It can do. When I was in Australia, I remember talking to the people who worked at the Australian War Memorial, and I don't know if people here have been to Canberra, but the Australian War Memorial is actually Australia's most visited museum, and it's a war memorial. And so the key stakeholders of that museum are all veterans. These are people who have a huge stake in the past and how it's interpreted. And talking to the staff who worked there, it really reinforced for me how much people care about museums, because every time they wanted to change an exhibit, they had to actually take the time to talk through with all of their stakeholders what changing that exhibit meant. And what they said at the Australian War Memorial is that actually we should all do that. And we should, because we're dealing with people's memories and we're dealing with the things that people have mapped onto the institutions. And people really care about the ROM. They care about the place very strongly. And so one of the things that I'm doing at the moment is we're thinking about our plan for the next few years, and we're trying to, as much as we can, talk to people about that and talk to people about what it will mean, because this is their space.
And when you're thinking about this programming, do you feel pressure that you have to come up with the blockbusters that draw the large numbers of people and allow you to pay the bills?
Well, I might just announce then that we are putting a dinosaur. We're putting a dinosaur display at the art gallery, and Frank and I are just talking about where we should put them, and. I think it's going to be pretty exciting, actually.
It'll do wonders, I'm sure, for the AGO attendance.
I think it's going to do very well. I think the whole question about blockbusters is a huge question, and I don't think that any generalization any of us would make is necessarily true. And what I mean by that is, I could sit here and say they're not part of our future, and they very well may.
There's nothing wrong with them, is there?
And no, I don't think there's anything wrong with them as long as they reinforce the core values and commitments of the institution. I think there is something wrong with them when they take you off what a community comes to expect and what they understand, and what gives them, to a certain extent, a combination of comfort and provocation. And you know, I think that the whole notion of invitation, maybe I'm more skeptical at this point about public institutions than you, but I find that there is a resistance to the notion of the public institution, right? It's a big space. Is it really inviting? You know, are people welcome there? Who's welcome there? What is the invitation? And we're thinking about it a lot talk a lot about that at the AGO at the moment because, you know, we're a city block long. Some people find us extraordinarily intimidating, just the notion of going up the steps and coming in. What do we wear? How do we behave? Who are we going to see there? And I don't think public institutions have really got beyond that. And the challenge that we have, I think, is that there's so many alternatives to going to museums these days that unless we really figure out what the invitation is and what the welcome is, I think we're going to find our audience is dwindling no matter whether we bring in blockbusters or not.
Well, what is happening with the audience? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it...
In our case, it went up with King Tut, stayed up nicely with Maharaja. We hope, starting on May 27th with Abstract Expressionist New York, it's going to stay up. But what we are finding is that the big challenge is how do you get people to move from what Janet calls affection and the good feeling about the ROM, the AGO, how do you actually move that feeling to a visit? Right? So there's lots of good feeling about the Art Gallery of Ontario, but it might be the spectacle, the blockbuster, the time-based experience that in the end is going to be the primary ingredient to actually get people to come.
Well, Janet, why do people go to museums and galleries? Do they go to see a show? Do they go to visit the old familiar display that they've seen since they were children? Or do they go because it's raining on a Sunday afternoon, they have to amuse their kids? All those reasons?
I think it is all those reasons. And for me, there's nothing wrong with a popular show that is well put together and draws a lot of people. So I agree with Matthew. I think in terms of a blockbuster, yes, there's something that have a part to play. Terracotta Warriors, I thought, was a great exhibition. I had nothing to do with it, so I can say that. I think it was great. We're going to do an exhibition later this year on Maya and that ancient culture, and I think it's going to be wonderful. And we've got loans coming from all over the world. There's new material which has come from Mexico, which is only just being documented now. This will be the first time it's seen anywhere, including in Mexico itself. And that's going to be a story about not just how the kings and queens lived, but also how the everyday people lived and what happened to the culture. And I think that's something that we can do really well in a museum, and it will be a great afternoon out. And I think people will come away, if we do this well, not only having felt that they've gained something about that culture, but also thinking a bit about how we live now and what we do. And I think museums can challenge and encourage people to reflect in that way.
So when you're looking back on the Maya show, when it's over, what will determine whether it was successful or not?
I think there are two things, and I too have been thinking about this aspect of how you turn affection into a visit. I think one will be, has it drawn the audience that we hoped it would? And,
numbers.
And not just the numbers, but did they enjoy themselves and did they benefit and learn in the way that we hoped they would? But the second thing is does that translate to them coming back again to the ROM? Does it mean that they become somebody for whom the ROM is I was going to say a habit, but more than a habit, you know, a minor obsession, or something where you need to come back on a regular basis, and for you the ROM is the place where it's at. For me, I'm most interested in how we can give people the opportunity to come back again and again, because it's the permanent collections that I think have generated the real affection. Those are the things that people really talk about, but at the moment I think we're underselling them slightly because we're focusing on the exhibitions, and I'd like to change that balance a little, because we've got some brilliant things at the ROM, absolutely brilliant.
I know you have dinosaurs.
And can I just say we have some of the best dinosaurs? But not only the dinosaurs. We've got one of the galleries that we have yet to do, but I think is going to be stupendous when we do it, is the slightly unromantically titled Gallery of Early Life. But there's this place in the Rockies called Burgess, and the Burgess Shale is perhaps the single most important fossil find that's ever been made, because it's a Canadian story, and it documents how the first multicellular animals, this is before things swam in the sea, this is before things trotted out onto the land, how the first animals that became the blueprints for everything that is alive today, that they were first shown. And we have that. And we can now tell that story with the scientists and the researchers that we've got, so that you can see the fossils and we can animate those and we can see what they would have been like. And you can imagine what it would have been like to be at that place at the time when they were alive. And now think about that. Think about that and then roll the clock forward by 500 million years to where we are now. This stuff, I think, does change the way that you see the world.
But you know, people could watch that on a 1-hour PBS special. I mean, is this the competition? I'm not defending PBS, I'm just saying.